In this video, I'll cover stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, a topic that is very related to the study of attitudes that we just covered in the previous video. In the previous video, we discussed how attitudes are a mental evaluation of a person, object, or issue. You can have attitudes about pretty much anything, including your attitude toward different celebrities, your stance on various political issues, or your preferences for different styles of music. However, what about when we have attitudes toward specific groups of people, such as attitudes toward men versus women, or attitudes about different majority and minority groups? This is where the study of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination comes in. First, we need to define some terms. In everyday language, people might use the words stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination somewhat interchangeably, but in the field of psychology, they actually mean three distinct, slightly different things. Remember the ABC model of attitudes, where attitudes are believed to comprise three related components: affect, cognitions, and behavioral intentions? Well, each of these three terms, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, correspond to a specific part of that model, as applied specifically to attitudes about groups of people. First, stereotypes refer to the cognitive beliefs we hold about someone or some group. Although we would all probably like to think that we do not hold any stereotypes about anyone, the fact is that nearly everyone does. For example, you probably have several stereotypes about different kinds of professions, such as stereotypes about doctors, professors, and lawyers. You might also hold stereotypes about people who wear certain brands of clothing, people from certain regions of the US, or people who are older or younger than you. Recall from Module 6 that our brains are always trying to categorize new information, and stereotypes are simply a way that our brain tries to categorize information about people. However, stereotypes can become harmful if they are applied too readily and too broadly. For example, in her later years, my grandmother would become very upset and frustrated if people started talking to her in a louder than normal voice, insisting that her hearing was just fine, thank you very much. A common stereotype of older individuals is that they are hard of hearing, but my grandma did not appreciate having this stereotype applied to her. It's also important to note that stereotypes can still be experienced as harmful, even if the stereotype itself appears on the surface to be a positive one. For example, a common stereotype of people from Canada is that they are overly friendly and polite. Other so-called positive stereotypes might be that Asian Americans tend to be good at math, and that African Americans tend to be more athletic. However, when someone is labeled as having a particular ability or quality based solely on their group membership, this can still be experienced by the person as negative and deeply uncomfortable. Whereas stereotyping involves a set of cognitive beliefs, prejudice has more to do with the A part of the ABC model, that is, the affect or feelings that we have towards certain groups or categories of people. For example, people often feel uncomfortable or negatively toward homeless individuals apart from their cognitive beliefs about them. A common way to measure prejudice is with an instrument called the feeling thermometer, which asks participants to rate their warmth or coldness toward a specific group on a scale from 0 to 100. Ratings below 50 are taken to mean negative feelings or prejudice toward that particular group. And this brings us to a major issue in this line of research, which is how to accurately measure people's stereotypes and prejudices. Whereas people might have no problem self-reporting their attitudes about celebrities or different styles of music, even if those attitudes are generally negative ones, people do usually avoid openly admitting to holding negative beliefs and feelings towards certain groups of people. If participants are not willing to acknowledge stereotypic beliefs or prejudiced feelings, how then can we scientifically study these phenomena? This is a very challenging question, and one that, in my opinion, still hasn't really been satisfactorily answered. Today, the most common way to measure stereotypes and prejudice is with something called the Implicit Association Test, often abbreviated as the IAT. Rather than using more explicit or conscious measures of people's attitudes towards certain groups, which are subject to social desirability concerns, the IAT instead attempts to measure attitudes and associations on a more unconscious level. Specifically, the IAT attempts to measure what has since come to be called implicit bias, that is, the unconscious and automatic associations that people form about certain groups of people. In theory, these implicit measures are more difficult for people to consciously control and therefore less susceptible to social desirability concerns. The setup for the IAT is a little bit complicated and occurs in several phases. First, participants are asked to categorize objects into two groups. So let's say that I wanted to measure your implicit preference for flowers versus insects. I could show you some words that relate to either insects or flowers, and you would have to press a different key on the keyboard depending on which group the word belonged to. Next, participants do the same categorization task again, but this time they categorize words as being either positive or negative. And in the third stage, these two categorization tasks are combined into one. So you would be shown a series of words on the screen that are either positive or negative, and you'd be shown words that relate to either flowers or insects. You would be instructed to press one key for words that are either positive or that relate to flowers, and you would press a different key for words that are either negative or that relate to insects. And lastly, these pairings are flipped. So you would press one key for words that are either positive or that relate to insects, and a different key for words that are either negative or that relate to flowers. The researchers can then examine participants' reaction times to see which pairing was easier. That is, were people faster to complete the task when flowers were paired with positive words versus negative ones? If participants complete the task faster when the flower and positive words were paired together, then this would indicate a positive implicit preference for flowers over insects. In theory, you could just swap out flowers versus insects for studying different groups of people, such as comparing whites with other racial groups, and there is a lot of research that does this. However, it's important to note that the IAT is also not without its critics. One criticism is that when people are measured multiple times on the IAT, their scores sometimes appear to change quite a bit. One explanation for this is that people's implicit attitudes are very flexible and can change a lot depending on the context. However, it's equally possible that the IAT itself is simply an unreliable measure to begin with. Another problem has to do with whether or not the IAT actually predicts biased behavior. Some research does find a small correlation between implicit bias, as measured by the IAT, and actual discriminatory behavior, but other research has failed to find this link. This is important because many anti-discrimination efforts in the past decade have focused on trying to change people's implicit biases. However, there is still ongoing debate about whether implicit biases can be changed, and if so, whether that's something worth doing to begin with. In other words, some people question whether changing people's implicit biases will result in any kind of meaningful difference in the outcomes that people actually experience. And this brings us to the topic of discrimination, which addresses the third and final part of the ABC model, behavior. As researchers define the term, discrimination specifically refers to people's actual objective behavior and treatment of others, and whether that treatment is more or less fair. For example, a person who is rejected for a job interview because they are perceived as too old would be an example of discrimination. In the workforce, employers are typically prohibited from discriminating against potential employees on the basis of age, sex, ethnicity, and other protected categories, although there are some legal exceptions to this, which we will explore more in Module 11 on IO psychology. However, some studies have found that discrimination does still happen. For example, do you remember the study I talked about in the previous video that looked at people's self-reported attitudes toward hiring ex-offenders compared to their actual behavior? This study also examined the race of the offender, specifically whether they were white or black. The study found that roughly 60% of employers self-reported that they would hire an ex-offender regardless of whether the offender was white or black. However, when the researchers examined what the employers actually did in an audit, they found that only 17% of white ex-offenders and only 5% of black ex-offenders were given a callback. Not only does this reveal stark differences in people's self-reported attitudes versus their actual behavior, but it also shows a fairly large difference of just over 10% in callbacks for white versus black ex-offender prospective employees. Other studies have sent out two versions of a mock resume to hundreds of potential employers and examined who gets a callback. The resumes are identical except for the name. For example, one study might compare a male name with a female name, or a traditionally white-sounding name with a traditionally non-white-sounding name. Many of these studies have found that, on average, minority groups tend to be slightly less likely to receive a callback. Again, the resumes were otherwise identical in terms of experience, etc., so the logical conclusion is that this is an indication of discriminatory behavior. However, again, the important question here is why. Over the past decade, much research has focused attention on implicit biases, and it may be that employers hold negative stereotypes about certain groups of people of which they are otherwise unaware, and that these unconscious biases lead them in subtle ways to prefer certain kinds of job candidates over others. However, since employers' implicit biases are never directly measured in these kinds of studies, this is an open question that we still don't really know the answer to. It's also important to note that these studies create somewhat of an artificial scenario where we can directly compare two identical resumes with only a different name. In this case, we can know with a bit more certainty that truly the only difference between these candidates was whether they were perceived to be from a specific race or gender. However, in real life, things generally tend to be more complicated, and inequalities that we observe on average between different groups of people can emerge for a number of different reasons. For example, much reporting has been done about the underrepresentation of women in science and math-related fields. While this could reflect barriers to entry for women in these areas, perhaps based on negative stereotypes, it could also be that women tend to prefer this kind of work less often than men, and are therefore simply less likely to choose to go into these kinds of fields in the first place. In all, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination are complex phenomena. There are likely no easy answers to these difficult questions, but in our own lives, we can try our best to treat each person as a unique individual worthy of our respect. For one of my favorite TED Talks on this topic, you can check out The Danger of the Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie in the supplemental videos section on Canvas. Let's pause for an application practice question before we close this video. Which of the following is an example of discrimination? The answer is C, Justine, who avoids hanging out with millennials. This is because this reflects Justine's actual behavior. Believing that millennials are lazy is an example of a stereotype, and feeling uncomfortable around seniors is an example of prejudice. In this video, we covered the related topics of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. For the exam, you should be able to define and distinguish between stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, and be able to identify each one in an example, define implicit bias, and explain how the IAT works and what it is designed to measure. Identify at least one benefit and at least one drawback of the IAT.